I was having coffee last week with an old colleague, a man who has spent 30 years in the upper echelons of Silicon Valley's logistics. He was practically beaming, tapping a news alert on his phone about the latest U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductors. "We finally boxed them in," he told me, leaning back with the smug satisfaction of a man who believes the world's rules are still written exclusively in English. He spoke about protecting the crown jewels and national security as if he were describing a fortress that was physically impossible to breach. To him, the West wasn't just winning, it was the only player that mattered. But then his phone buzzed again. It was a brief, dry update regarding China's Ministry of Commerce and their anti-discrimination investigation into U.S. integrated circuits. I watched his expression shift in real time. The giddy excitement evaporated, replaced by a tight defensive frown. He started muttering about legal overreach and state interference, his voice rising in a way that signaled genuine anxiety. What struck me wasn't the news itself, but his reaction. Moments ago, he was celebrating the use of trade as a weapon. Now, faced with a mirror image of that same tactic, he was indignant. He couldn't seem to process the irony. He was looking at a set of legal maneuvers, the unreliable entity list, the anti-foreign sanctions law, that weren't just reactive, but part of a cold, multi-decade strategic relay. While he was thinking in fiscal quarters, the players on the other side were thinking in generations. That sudden pivot from arrogance to anger felt like a microcosm of a much larger shift. It made me realize that we aren't just witnessing a trade war. We are watching the quiet, methodical dismantling of a global hierarchy. It raised a chilling question. What happens to a civilization that has forgotten how to build when it realizes it no longer has the power to tell others what they are allowed to create? That anecdote, it really just anchors us, doesn't it? It shows that that cognitive dissonance when a system based on political process suddenly slams into one that's just ruthlessly focused on outcome.
It really does. And the question it raises, is this just a temporary friction, or is this a deep structural dismantling of power? That's what we need to get into.
Right. It requires moving beyond just the day-to-day trade headlines.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to use the analysis available to us to really explain that fundamental shift. And to do that, we're going to use three different lenses. They move from, political machinery all the way out to deep philosophy.
Okay, let's unpack those. What are the three frameworks that are going to help us see these tectonic plates shifting?
So first, we have to compare the strategic governance models themselves.
Okay.
We're going to look at the East Asian Developmental State and its really remarkable capacity for technocratic efficiency.
And contrast that with the Western system.
And contrast that with the Western system, which has been labeled a vetocracy, a system basically defined by institutional paralysis. I mean, we're talking about two totally different political operating systems trying to manage the same global economy.
Okay, so that's the first lens. The machinery of government. What's the second?
The second moves us into the consequences of this rivalry for everyone else. We'll use a bit of game theory here. We're going beyond the simple idea of zero-sum competition.
Where my win is your loss.
Precisely. And we're looking at the very dangerous risk of shifting into what's called an epic fail equilibrium. That's an outcome where everyone, including the big powers themselves, ends up structurally worse off, even as they're just trying to advance their own self-interest.
And the third lens, you said it was philosophical.
It is. We zoom way out to the philosophical timescale, and we consider Oswald Spengler's cyclical predictions about civilizational decline. We'll look at the markers he pointed to for the decline of the West, things like the age of money, the rise of the world city, and we'll contrast that with this emerging model of powerful goal-oriented technocracies in Asia.
So if we connect those three ideas, the governance models, the risk of systemic failure, and then this big philosophical arc of history, we should get a pretty clear picture of what's happening.
That's the goal, to gauge the true scale of this disruption.
All right, let's start with that first lens then. The engine of modern East Asian success. The developmental state, or the DS. It sounds kind of, bureaucratic, but the analysis makes it clear it's really a whole political philosophy in action.
It's so much more than bureaucracy. The developmental state is fundamentally defined as a phenomenon of state-led macroeconomic planning. The key here is that the state wields independent, autonomous political power, and it exercises extensive, disciplined control over the economy.
So the state isn't just reacting. It's not just, setting the traffic rules for commerce.
Not at all. It's actively setting the strategic direction for the entire economy, sometimes decades in advance.
Okay, so if the state is steering, what does that steering actually look like? How is it fundamentally different from the model that, we see in the US or most of Europe?
The core distinction is its orientation. A developmental state has a developmental orientation. It's actively focused on promoting new, high-value industries. It systematically pursues industrial policies that aren't designed to correct the market, but to forge entirely new national capabilities.
It's a forward-looking strategy, building capacity.
Exactly. Now, you contrast that with what's called the regulatory state, which has historically been dominant in the U.S. A regulatory state governs through agencies, the EPA, the SEC. Their job is mainly to enforce standards, monitor behavior, and protect the public against existing market failures.
Things like monopolies, pollution, financial fraud.
Right. The regulatory state is there to keep the system clean. The developmental state imposes a vision to make the system grow, but in very specific strategic directions.
That implies a kind of elite guidance that has to be really insulated from the political messiness of daily life. Otherwise, that long-term vision would get compromised constantly.
That insulation is absolutely critical. The DS model relies on non-elected bureaucratic elites, often highly educated technocratic planners, who rigidly guide and, this is crucial, restrict the private sector.
And the argument for that is it lets the government plan based on long-term national interest?
Yes. The policies can bypass the disruptive influence of short-term demands, whether those demands come from corporations who just want quarterly profits or from working-class interests that are expressed through the democratic political process. The stability, the foresight, the ability to execute unpopular but necessary changes, that's seen as foundational to its success.
I can definitely see how that structure would alarm my colleague. He sees that insulation as legal overreach, but the developmental state would see it as, necessary autonomy for national survival.
That's a perfect way to put it. Let's look at how this actually translated into success. The iconic example is South Korea. South Korea is a superb illustration of this state-led late industrialization. After the 1961 military coup, the government under Park Chung-hee set out to deliberately emulate the architecture of the Japanese system, specifically Japan's incredibly influential Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI.
So Korea built their own version?
They did. They established the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the MTI, and the very powerful Economic Planning Board, the EPB.
Okay, so how did those two bodies work together to direct the market? What were their actual functions?
The EPB was, you could argue, the most powerful body in the entire government. It controlled the national budget, major investment decisions, and the flow of all foreign aid and loans. The MTI, meanwhile, acted as the direct implementation arm. It worked with the key conglomerates, the key balls.
And they had these formal plans, right?
Yes, their joint operation formalized policy objectives through a series of 5-year plans. And they engaged in what scholars call deliberately getting relative prices wrong.
Okay, that phrase jumps out, getting prices wrong. That sounds completely counterintuitive to free market thinking.
It is, and that's the key insight. They intentionally manipulated financial incentives to deviate prices and subsidies from what would be the right market equilibrium price. They did this to achieve a national objective, which was rapid, export-oriented industrialization.
Can you give us some specific examples of how they got the prices wrong?
Certainly. So in the 1970s, they made this massive strategic pivot from light manufacturing, like textiles, into heavy and chemical industries. To do that, the state granted substantial long-term, low-interest loans and credits, often subsidized at below-market rates, to the chaebols that were willing to enter those sectors.
So if you were building ships or steel, you got cheap money.
You got cheap money, you got selective manipulation of exchange rates, you got preferential access to scarce foreign currency. If you were a shipbuilding or steel conglomerate, you received every resource you needed, even if on paper, a private bank might have looked at the project and said it was way too risky.
And the result?
This centralized mobilization of capital into strategic sectors allowed GDP per capita to just explode. It went from under $900 in 1950 to over $22,000 by 2010.
That speed of transformation is just staggering, but it required a government that was totally comfortable imposing those changes on the private sector.
It did. And you see similar protective mechanisms used elsewhere. Look at Thailand's aggressive use of protectionism, which was focused on what's called import substitution.
Right, protecting their own industries.
Thailand's policy really highlights the state's ability to impose significant friction on international trade to protect its own domestic capabilities. They implemented extremely high tariffs, sometimes up to 80%, even 150% on imported consumer and industrial goods.
And the goal was to shield their infant factories.
Exactly, to allow domestic firms to mature without being crushed by foreign competition. The developmental state model here shows the political strength needed to resist both internal pressure from wealthy citizens who might want cheaper, better imported goods, and external pressure from powerful trading partners.
What about foreign investment? How did they manage multinationals coming in without just letting them extract all the value?
They leveraged that incoming investment ruthlessly toward their national goals. So in the auto industry, for instance, they mandated that foreign auto manufacturers had to establish joint ventures where a 51% controlling stake was held by Thai entities.
That was non-negotiable.
Non-negotiable. The intent was crystal clear: technology transfer, skill development, and ensuring that jobs and, crucially, profits remained anchored inside the country. This systematic approach helped slash the national poverty rate from around 60% in the 1960s down to the 13–15% range by 2004.
So the efficiency isn't just measured in industrial output, but in real public welfare gain.
Demonstrable improvements.
Yeah.
And then you have Singapore, which is a masterclass in applying this model even without the land or natural resources of its neighbors. Their focus pivoted very early on to human capital planning.
The developmental city-state.
That's what it is. Its initial strategy was simple: attract MNCs with cheap, disciplined labor and political stability. But that was just a stepping stone. They knew that sustained growth required a structural pivot based on foresight. So the government became the master planner of the national labor market.
How do you even manage that on such a macro scale?
Through systematic national education reform that was directly tied to the 5-year economic plan. A prime example is the Vocational and Industrial Training Board, the VITB, established in 1970.
And what was its function?
The VITB's unique function was to precisely match the skills of the nation's workforce to the forecasted economic development demands. So if the planners decided the nation needed to pivot from basic electronics assembly to, say, precision engineering or biotech within 5 years, the VITB would immediately overhaul curricula and training pipelines to supply that specific kind of labor.
So they planned both the demand for labor through industrial policy and the supply through education.
A perfect feedback loop. It allowed them to adapt so quickly and move up the value chain from basic manufacturing to high-tech services without the disruptive lag time you see in less centralized systems.
Okay, so this technocratic, goal-oriented system, built on stability, insulated long-term vision, it stands in stark contrast to the Western counterpoint you mentioned earlier, the Vetocracy. Francis Fukuyama coined this term.
Yes, and it describes a governance system so saturated with checks and balances or veto points that no single entity or political faction can acquire enough power to make and execute significant decisions.
It's defined by an excessive ability to stop things.
An excessive ability to halt, block, or veto action without any adequate functioning mechanism to override that veto. The system is, by its nature, designed for prevention, not for creation.
And when we look at the reality of federal legislation in the U.S., that gauntlet seems almost impossible to run successfully.
It's a legislative maze. I mean, think about the number of institutional veto points for any federal bill. It starts with a representative. It has to satisfy House committee chairs, survive the committee process, maybe bypass the Hastert rule. Then it moves to the Senate for another round of committees, committee chairs, the huge power of the filibuster, maybe even the Senate parliamentarian.
And that's before the president can veto it.
Right, which then requires a 2/3 override in both houses. And then finally, the Supreme Court stands as the ultimate constitutional veto point.
And that's just the formal structure. On top of that, you have the massive influence of organized interests.
Absolutely. External, powerful forces add another whole layer of veto capability. Corporate lobbying, for example, is estimated to be something like 4 times greater in volume and spending than all other forms of lobbying combined: public interests, unions, nonprofits.
So established, wealthy interests can use the system's complexity to just veto any change that might threaten their position. It cements the status quo.
Which leads to a predictable outcome: paralysis.
And the data shows this.
The data reflects it perfectly. The success rate of federal legislation in the U.S. has dropped off a cliff, from around 7% historically to a current rate of just 2%. The entire system is structurally gridlocked. And that makes massive, long-term strategic projects like, say, a green energy transition or a sustained push into advanced semiconductors incredibly difficult to achieve, or at least incredibly slow and expensive.
But this paralysis isn't just a Washington thing, is it? The critique noted that this vetocracy exists at the subnational level, too. We feel its effects every day.
We absolutely do. This subnational paralysis is a huge driver of dysfunction. It shows up in the unusually high costs and the staggering timelines for infrastructure and housing construction. Every proposed project, whether it's a new transit line or even just a simple apartment complex, it runs into this myriad of local veto point zoning boards, environmental impact reviews, neighborhood associations, permitting agencies.
Give me a relatable example of how that plays out in terms of cost.
Okay, think about the cost of building subway lines. In developmental states, these big transit projects are executed efficiently, with minimal political interference. In the US, the cost per mile is often 10 times higher than in Western Europe or East Asia.
10 times.
When you try to build even a short stretch of subway in a major American city, the sheer number of mandatory reviews, political challenges, and lawsuits, and each one of those is a veto opportunity, it can multiply the cost from a few $100 million to several $1 billion and add a decade or more to the timeline. That inability to build big, physical things efficiently, that is the signature failing of the vetocracy.
Which brings us right back to my colleague from Silicon Valley. His indignation over China's state interference suddenly makes so much more sense when you see it through this architectural lens.
His whole assumption was that the world operates under vetocracy rules, that governance is inherently slow, inefficient, and susceptible to wealthy, localized vetoes. He was celebrating a U.S. policy that used the existing rules to impose an external bloc.
But then he saw the countermove.
And he was shocked. Because when he saw the countermove, a strategic legal maneuver implemented by a highly focused developmental state, he realized their system has the capacity to plan, execute, and deliver a strategic counterpunch much, much faster and more decisively than his own system.
So the developmental state's legitimacy comes from its delivery, its capacity to build physical, economic reality.
While the vetocracy's legitimacy comes from its process and its openness, which often comes at the direct cost of delivery.
And that contrast really defines this new geopolitical friction.
It does. The developmental state doesn't confuse the slow, deliberate process of politics with the urgent requirements of national governance and economic survival. I mean, in the Asian technocratic mindset, delay and paralysis aren't just unfortunate side effects. They are seen as a form of institutional corruption, a failure to achieve necessary outcomes for the population. This deep difference in operating systems is why the competition today is so fundamentally asymmetric.
Okay, so that clash of governance models really sets the stage for our second theme. How this rivalry is playing out in the global economic system, creating a dynamic that's potentially more dangerous than just simple competition.
That's right. We're seeing this deep coupling between geopolitics and international economics.
What do you mean by coupling?
It's the engine of the problem. As geopolitical conditions get worse, rivalries over chips, trade balances territory, the economic connections immediately come under attack. Nationalist sentiment encourages policymakers to weaponize trade and investment to achieve their national security goals.
Which then makes the geopolitical rivalry even worse.
Exactly. It creates this vicious, self-reinforcing downward cycle where economic prosperity becomes secondary to national security.
The immediate intellectual trap of this kind of intense rivalry is to think that we're in a zero-sum game. It's that mentality driven by ranking. Who is number one?
And zero-sum thinking is powerful because it simplifies the world. It suggests that one side wins only if the other side loses. It makes compromise seem strategically impossible or even naive.
But if you look at the huge challenges facing the globe, financial stability, pandemics, the climate crisis, those aren't zero-sum.
Not at all. Win-win outcomes are absolutely available. These are positive-sum opportunities where coordinated action benefits everyone, regardless of who is temporarily number one.
And yet, we seem to be consistently failing to achieve those positive-sum outcomes. And that failure is what makes the situation worse than zero-sum. It leads to this tragedy of epic fail.
An epic fail equilibrium is just disastrous. It happens when everyone ends up worse off, even though every nation was acting rationally and just trying to advance its own self-interest. It's like the highest stakes version of the prisoner's dilemma, where the collective outcome is a failure for everybody.
Can you clarify the ingredients for that? What makes that dangerous equilibrium possible on a global scale?
Two things have to be present. First, win-win outcomes have to be technically available. We know, for example, that coordinated climate transition strategies would be cheaper and more effective globally than uncoordinated national efforts.
So the better option is there on the table.
It's there. Second, individual self-advancement must lead to a losing equilibrium for everyone. So, when great powers start to view positive-sum economic engagement like stable global trade through zero-sum security lens, and they start weaponizing trade with tariffs and controls, Well, that transmogrifies the situation into an epic fail. Everyone suffers from lower efficiency, higher costs, and greater instability.
And we've seen clear geopolitical actions from the U.S. that justified this shift away from free trade, even if they risk a collective epic fail.
The U.S. shift toward assertive industrial policy, like the CHPS and Science Act, is justified by policymakers based on perceived rampant market failure, often linked to competitors' practices and critical national security needs. This inherently moves policy away from global free trade norms.
And a defining moment was the U.S. rejection of that WTO ruling on the steel and aluminum tariffs.
That was a profound signal. The U.S. asserted that the WTO, and by extension global trade rules, should not second-guess national security decisions made by sovereign governments. Historically, the use of that security exemption, JOT Article XD1, was meant to be extremely limited to prevent abuse.
So by overriding that norm, the U.S. signaled a major strategic shift.
A major shift away from the rules-based multilateral trading system. And that decision just reinforces the vicious cycle because it weakens the very institutions that can help facilitate cooperation.
And this strategic priority led pretty quickly from a policy of engagement to one of containment.
Exactly. And you see that exemplified by the export controls targeting advanced semiconductors and manufacturing equipment. Now, that policy is explicitly aimed at forcing allies and partners to choose sides in strategic sectors. It's a security competition strategy, trying to gain a relative advantage by actively hindering a rival's progress.
Which is the definition of zero-sum thinking.
It is. And it inevitably fuels the movement toward an epic fail equilibrium in the broader economy.
We tend to focus solely on the two great powers, but you emphasize that the fate of the global order really hinges on the agency of third nations, the vast majority of the world.
They are the essential stabilizing force. You can think of China and the U.S. as the supply side of world order. They establish the rules, the norms. They provide global public goods like stability or the reserve currency.
And third nations are the demand side.
Right. Around 80% of humanity. And while they might seem like passive price takers, the equilibrium of the global system ultimately depends on their collective demand. If the great powers are determined to spiral toward an epic fail, third nations can exercise their agency to nudge the system toward better outcomes.
So if explicit collaboration between the great powers is just a bridge too far right now, the goal is inadvertent cooperation. How do third nations facilitate that?
They have to strategically navigate the environment. Their goal is to create conditions where, even if the great powers are acting only in their self-interest, the collective outcome avoids disaster. They do this by actively pushing back against the zero-sum narrative and refusing to be forced into rigid choices.
Their argument has to be that a choice-based system restricts options, while a rules-based system expands them.
Exactly. And there are concrete strategies they can employ. First, they should actively dispense with the idea of a single number one global hegemon. They should promote a vision of multiple number one nations, each specific to a problem domain.
So one nation might lead on climate, another on financial stability, another on manufacturing efficiency.
Precisely. It directly combats that unhelpful zero-sum ranking mindset. Second, they have to isolate the problem domains that are genuinely zero-sum, say a specific military technology, and put them in a small, defined sandbox. Then they can focus their energy on the vast majority of issues, like food security and public health, which are positive sum but are at risk of epic fail.
And the most powerful tool they have is to uphold the established global framework itself, even when the great powers violate it.
That is their anchor. By abiding by and continually reinforcing multilateral rules and principles, they create a kind of institutional gravity that pulls the great powers back toward stability. And we've seen powerful examples of this.
Like what?
The G7 Hiroshima leaders' communique, despite all the U.S.-China tension, explicitly emphasized the ongoing importance of a functioning, rules-based WTO. And Europe successfully reframed U.S. policy from the confrontational zero-sum term decoupling, which sounds like ripping out global links to the softer, more manageable concept of de-risking.
These semantic and institutional nudges subtly reinforce the structure.
They increase the political cost for the great powers to deviate entirely. And this whole concept of coordinated third nation agency, it's not new, it has historical precedent.
You're talking about the non-aligned movement.
Absolutely. The 1961 non-aligned movement, which came out of the principles of the 1955 Bandung Conference, is a powerful historical counterpart. It was a successful global coordination effort built on principles like respect for sovereignty and peaceful negotiation. It proved that a collective of demand-side nations can successfully coordinate to shape the structure of international engagement.
They provided an alternative to the bipolar friction of the Cold War.
Their goal then, as it should be now, was to avoid being dragged into an epic fail scenario that was devised by others.
Okay, we've moved from political mechanics to global strategy. Now let's take that longest possible view, zooming out to the philosophical scale of history. Oswald Spengler's thesis isn't about policy changes, it's about the life cycle of civilizations.
Right. Spengler's the decline of the West fundamentally rejects the common linear narrative of history. The idea that humanity progresses from ancient to medieval to modern.
He saw it as cyclical.
Exactly. He proposed that high cultures, like the Western Faustian or the classical Apollonian or the Cynic, are organisms. They are born, they flourish, and they inevitably decline and perish over a lifespan of about 1,000 years. So this model suggests that the friction we're seeing today isn't a crisis that can be solved with a policy adjustment, but a biological stage in Western history, the late autumn giving way to winter.
And the central concept for him is this transition from culture to civilization. What's the soul-level distinction between those two stages?
Culture is the period of the soul. It's the inward-focused, creative, dynamic becoming phase. This is where truly original art, architecture, and religious systems emerge. Think Gothic cathedrals or early Christianity. Civilization, on the other hand, is the stage of the intellect. It's the artificial, set-fast, declining late phase, characterized by outward expansion, massive cities, and purely mechanical achievements.
The intellect rules after the soul has abdicated.
That's a great way to put it. The soul has abdicated its spiritual authority.
So when a culture transforms into a civilization, its expansion isn't really a sign of strength, but more a sign of exhaustion.
Precisely. Spengler was profoundly pessimistic about the stage of civilization. He argued that the expansion of an empire during this final phase, the ambition to conquer territories or dominate trade, is not actual vigorous growth. It's merely taking possession of that which lay open to everyone.
It's a hollow triumph.
Characterized by spiritual exhaustion and immense arrogance, using power that was gained in the earlier, more vital phase.
For the West, what he called Faustian civilization, he identified several concrete markers that signal this terminal stage is upon us. What's the first great sign?
The first, and maybe the most devastating marker, is the rise of the world city. This is where the spiritual homeland, the countryside, the small town, the rooted motherland where the culture was born, is essentially obliterated by the gravitational pull of these.
And he saw these megalopolises as purely intellectual, detached, homeless.
And they foster a mob. That was his term. He saw this urbanized population as nomadic, traditionless, and inherently irreligious, characterized by what he called a cold intelligence. They have high abstract reasoning ability for things like complex finance and administration, but they lack that deep, instinctive spiritual core that defined the culture in its youth. They are consumers of civilization, not creators of culture.
And the second marker connects that spiritual decline directly to the mechanics of the vetocracy we talked about, the rule of money.
Spengler argued that the definitive shift to civilization is marked by the absolute penetration of money's power throughout society. He saw money as the ultimate abstract intellectual concept that transcends all tradition and value, and so it becomes the only true power in the civilizational stage.
And he viewed Western political institutions, democracy, suffrage, the free press, not as virtues, but as tools of this power.
Yes. For Spengler, concepts like universal suffrage and freedom of the press eventually become political weapons that serve the interests of plutocracy, the rule of the wealthy. Since mass media requires massive financing and political elections demand enormous donations, these systems are ultimately set in motion and controlled by moneyed interests. The political class just executes the strategy of the financial class.
He saw this democratic phase as being fundamentally exhausted, and he predicted a profound political shift away from parliamentary systems.
Spengler believed the West was scheduled to enter its deep winter, its pre-death emergency, at the start of the 21st century. He foresaw the end of this exhausted democratic phase, a system that has devolved into the gridlock of the vetocracy we discussed. It reaches a point where the population is just tired of the paralysis and the perceived corruption of the money-driven political machine.
And this exhaustion leads to the universal final stage of every high culture, Caesarism. He actually predicted the start of the modern Caesarist era around 2022.
He did. The shift from Napoleonism to Caesarism is a universal stage that takes about 2 centuries in every culture's life cycle. Modern Caesarism is the rise of a personal, non-formal dictatorial power, and it's fundamentally a violent reaction against the dominance of moneyed interests in politics. The battle is defined as the will to order of the emerging Caesar fighting against the forces of dictatorial money economics.
So this Caesar figure isn't necessarily a military ruler, but a formless personal authority that overrides constitutional constraints.
Exactly. Once Caesarism is accomplished, the spirit of constitutional forms dies entirely. The real importance shifts from the written law and the deliberative assembly to the wholly personal power exercised by the Caesar.
And he had a pretty dark view of the future of conflict.
He foresaw a century of gigantic conflicts, not necessarily between nations, but private feuds between these rising Caesars who will use mass media and raw charisma to gain power. He predicted the methods of conflict would become more savage and ferocious, a return to nature and a loss of the old chivalry, simply because the old rules and systems would have lost all spiritual authority.
That is a chilling prediction. It forces you to look at the current gridlock in Washington in a completely new light. So if this is the philosophical trajectory of the West, how do we juxtapose that with the rising power of East Asian governance, which seems so stable and disciplined?
The contrast is powerful, and it really supports the core Spenglerian argument about succession. While the West is paralyzed by vetocracy and consumed by the political exhaustion of the age of money, Asian governments are increasingly demonstrating capacity. They favor pragmatic, outcome-oriented governance and place high value on highly skilled, technocratic civil servants over charismatic politicians.
So the technocratic model possesses the necessary will to order that the declining civilization has lost.
Precisely. The core strength of the technocratic approach in Asia is that its only ideology is pragmatism. They are focused entirely on measurable delivery, building infrastructure, ensuring high-quality education, creating jobs. They prioritize efficiency because, as we said, delay is viewed as a form of institutional corruption.
And institutions like Singapore's Civil Service College are now the epicenter for this kind of planning.
They're the global epicenter for rigorous economic master planning, emphasizing foresight and data-driven governance. So in this context, the efficient, goal-oriented Asian technocracy appears to possess the ability to build and enforce a vision that the declining Faustian civilization, stuck in its vetocracy, is visibly losing.
Okay, these philosophical and political frameworks are compelling, but they have to be grounded in real-world data. And our sources provided evidence on how this tension is playing out in the most important physical system, global value chains, or GVCs. We've seen massive reallocation since 2016.
The context for this reallocation is critical. Global value chains have been hit by a triple crisis in rapid succession between 2016 and 2023. This started with the US-China trade tensions and tariffs, then was compounded by the severe supply shocks and lockdowns during the COVID-19 pandemic, and finally, the geopolitical disruption from the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
And those shocks created unprecedented pressure to reduce dependence and diversify supply chains.
Exactly.
The stated goal of the U.S. strategy was clear: decoupling, or at least significantly reducing direct import dependence on China. So what do the macro trade shifts show? Did it work?
Well, the initial decoupling efforts did show some visible success, at least on the U.S. side. U.S. imports from China declined sharply across targeted sectors, especially apparel, metals, and increasingly machinery. This aligns perfectly with the policy objective of reducing vulnerability by sourcing elsewhere.
But that's only half the story.
It is. If you look at China's exports globally, they didn't contract. They remained remarkably robust. They demonstrated a strategic ability to pivot and expand across other international markets. Chinese machinery exports, for instance, registered widespread gains across nearly all major trading partners outside the U.S. and Japan during the later part of this period.
So China rerouted its exports and maintained momentum while the U.S. changed its sourcing. And this is where the structural reality of the China Plus One strategy becomes so clear, this triangular export relationship.
This relationship is the key to understanding why trade diversion does not equal dependence reduction. The data shows that the U.S. successfully shifted imports away from China and toward its favored friendshoring and nearshoring partners.
So we saw spikes in imports from ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and from Mexico.
Right, especially in high-volume goods like apparel and machinery. And on the surface, that looks like diversification success.
But the deeper analysis reveals that these new suppliers are just acting as intermediaries.
Exactly. The central finding is that these very same third nations, the ones the U.S. is importing finished goods from, simultaneously showed a dramatic and significant rise in imports from China. This implies a deep and embedded triangular relationship. These nations are not replacing China. They are relying on China for the upstream intermediate inputs, the components, the high-tech parts, the specialized machinery to produce the finished goods that they then re-export to the U.S.
So let me see if I've got this right. If I'm a U.S. company that used to buy a finished machine from Shenzhen, I now buy that finished machine from a factory in Vietnam.
Right.
But the crucial components for that machine, the specialized motors or circuits, were shipped from Shenzhen to Vietnam first.
That is precisely the mechanism. The supply chain hasn't been disrupted. It has simply added a layer of intermediation. The economic reality is that China has repositioned itself to become the indispensable upstream supplier to these re-export platforms.
This requires us to look beyond just simple trade volume and understand the functional positioning within the global value chain structure. You have to distinguish between upstream and downstream functions.
This is a crucial distinction that comes from GVC decomposition analysis. Think of any complex manufactured product, a sophisticated piece of machinery. The production process involves multiple stages. The upstream stage involves complex, high-value-added activities. Specialized component manufacturing, high-precision tooling, R&D, intermediate inputs.
And a downstream stage is the lower value stuff, final assembly, packaging, logistics.
Exactly. And what the GVC decomposition shows about China's functional repositioning is that its manufacturing exports to its regional partners, like Vietnam, Singapore, and Thailand, shifted progressively upstream.
They increased their GVC position.
They did, meaning a greater share of the value added they contribute to the global economy is now embedded in the intermediate production stages of their partner economies' re-exported goods. They're focusing on selling the essential components and specialized machinery, especially in high-tech areas. This move reinforces China's structural centrality, not as the final assembler, but as the critical embedded supplier of industrial ingredients.
So what was the U.S. role in this shift? Did the U.S. successfully replace China in these upstream functions?
Quite the opposite. The U.S. export trajectory to ASEAN countries shows a progressive weakening of its role in regional value-added circulation. The data shows declines in both GVC participation and position.
Which is consistent with the retreat from intermediate production.
A retreat. It reflects a focus on localization or simple reshoring. But this retreat leaves a vacuum in upstream capabilities within the region, and it's a vacuum that China's developmental efficiency has been uniquely positioned to fill.
So this implies that the U.S. goal of genuinely reducing supply chain dependence remains structurally unmet.
It does. The structural constraints facing U.S. decoupling efforts are formidable. China's deep integration reflects structural capabilities that just cannot be replicated quickly in alternative hubs. This includes technological scale, decades of sustained logistical superiority, and the institutional efficiency of the developmental state model. The effort to shift production just created a new layer of intermediation, which actually increased the relatedness of supply chains to China, rather than their redundancy.
So we have to redefine what resilience means in this context.
Resilience has shifted. It's moved away from the simple idea of mere redundancy, having backup factories in multiple countries, to deep structural embeddedness and relatedness. China's strategic repositioning demonstrates a mastery of this new resilience. Ensuring its value added remains essential to the final product, regardless of where that product is assembled.
And the U.S. faces the challenge of overcoming the Vetocracy's paralysis to restore its own upstream capabilities through sustained industrial reinvestment, a task that's proven historically difficult.
It has. The new global economic hierarchy is defined by who controls the upstream segments and the capacity to efficiently create and build the complex components that matter most.
This deep dive has shown that the friction we observe today is a systemic feature, not a temporary bug. We began with the stunned realization of a Silicon Valley veteran that the rules he celebrated were being used against him, revealing a profound difference in governance capacity.
And our analysis shows that this disruption is structural. It's marked by this powerful divergence in political operating systems. We have seen the triumph of long-term, technologically embedded technocratic efficiency, the developmental state model, and that's been validated empirically by the reconfiguration of global value chains.
China's strategic move upstream, cementing its structural centrality through these key third nations, that's the material proof that capacity and strategic planning are dictating global economic outcomes now.
And this structural shift is happening precisely as the political system in the West demonstrates exhaustion. The Vetocracy model, it prioritizes deliberative process and veto power, and the result is institutional paralysis, and the chronic inability to execute the massive long-term strategic investments needed to restore upstream manufacturing and compete effectively.
This structural reality seems to confirm the philosophical prediction of a civilizational transition, where the strategic will to order, focused on execution and building, inevitably supersedes the age of money and exhausted democratic forms that Spengler foresaw.
The current geopolitical friction is less about a trade war and more about a methodical dismantling of a global hierarchy built on assumptions that are no longer supported by governance capacity or economic fact.
The new global hierarchy is defined not by political rhetoric or even by a nation's preference for a specific trade policy, but by who controls the act of creating, building, and most importantly, the complex structural embeddedness within the world's most functional value chains. The ability to plan, build, and deliver, not just to impose rules, is now the ultimate decisive measure of power.